Why are Kenyans rejecting a top US general on their soil? The truth might shock you. Crowds in Kenya confront Michael Langley. What they said sent a global message. Traoré's rival walks into Kenya, but the people weren't silent. See what happened next. Is this the beginning of the end for US influence in Africa? Langley learns the hard way. They told Langley to leave. Kenyan voices rise against US interference. Here's WHYANA's shocking turn of events. US General Michael Langley, known for his firm stance against Captain Ibrahim Traoré's anti-imperialist movement, made an unexpected visit to Kenya, only to be met with public outrage. As Africa rises in unity and resistance, Kenyan citizens are voicing their disapproval of US foreign influence and siding with the Pan-African vision promoted by Traoré and other revolutionary leaders. Why are Kenyans rejecting a top US general on their soil? What does Langley's visit really mean for Africa? Is this the beginning of the end for US influence in Africa? Why are Kenyans calling him a sellout? Is this the beginning of a stronger African alliance against Western dominance? This video breaks down the growing tensions between the African people and US military interests, and how this moment could mark a historic shift in Africa's geopolitical landscape. Watch till the end to hear the voices of real Africans on the ground and understand why the continent is choosing freedom over foreign control. 1. Why are Kenyans rejecting a top US general on their soil? Background and context. The rejection of US General Michael Langley, head of the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, stems from a high-level meeting he held in Nairobi with Kenyan defense officials, which was described as a strategic engagement. This visit, occurring in early May 2025, sparked significant backlash from some African quarters, particularly among Pan-Africanists and commentators who view Kenya's alignment with the US as compromising African sovereignty. Reasons for rejection: perceived neocolonialism. Critics, as seen in posts on X, label General Langley as an enemy of African sovereignty, and accuse Kenya of acting as a Western military outpost. They argue that hosting AFRICOM's commander signals Kenya's complicity in advancing US geopolitical interests over African self-determination. For instance, a post by @AfricanHub_ explicitly called for Langley's deportation, framing his visit as neocolonialism. Allegations against Langley. Langley has been criticized for remarks reportedly made about Burkina Faso's transitional leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, labeling him a threat to his own people. These comments, highlighted in sources like Black Westchester, are seen as part of a broader US strategy to undermine African leaders who resist Western influence, particularly those aligning with non-Western powers like Russia or China. Regional sensitivities. The backlash is amplified by Kenya's growing military and political alignment with the US, which contrasts with the actions of other African nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These countries have formed the Alliance of Sahel States, expelling French troops and rejecting Western military presence, which resonates with Pan-African sentiments that Kenya is seen as countering. Domestic criticism. Within Kenya, some citizens and commentators, as reflected in posts on X, express frustration with their government's warm reception of Langley. They view it as a betrayal of Pan-African ideals, especially given Kenya's history as a leader in African independence movements. A post by @MosCampton questions why a Kenyan TV station would roll out the red carpet for Langley, suggesting a disconnect between the government and public sentiment. Counter-perspective. Not all Kenyans may oppose Langley's visit. The Kenyan government likely sees the engagement as a pragmatic move to strengthen bilateral ties, especially given US support in counterterrorism and economic partnerships. Kenya hosts US military facilities, like the Manda Bay base, which are critical for operations against groups like Al-Shabaab. However, this pragmatic alignment fuels perceptions of Kenya as a US proxy, intensifying criticism from those prioritizing sovereignty. Limitations. The extent of public rejection is unclear, as X posts reflect vocal but possibly niche sentiments. Mainstream Kenyan media or government statements may not fully echo this backlash, suggesting a divide between elite policy and grassroots sentiment. 2. What does Langley's visit really mean for Africa? Strategic context. General Langley's visit to Nairobi in May 2025 was part of ongoing US efforts to maintain influence in Africa amid growing competition from China and Russia. As commander of AFRICOM, Langley oversees US military operations across the continent, focusing on counterterrorism, training local forces, and countering rival powers' influence. His visit coincided with the African Lion 2025 exercise, a major US-led military drill involving over 40 nations, signaling continued US commitment to African partnerships. Implications for Africa. Shift in US strategy. Langley emphasized a pivot toward burden sharing, encouraging African partners to achieve independent operations. This reflects a U.S. pullback from direct intervention, possibly due to domestic pressures or strategic reprioritization, as noted in Newsweek and AP News. The shift could mean less U.S. military presence but increased reliance on local forces, which may strain African militaries lacking resources. Countering rival influence, Langley's remarks during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on April 3, 2025, highlighted U.S. concerns about Chinese and Russian influence. He accused China of seeking global dominance and Russia of exploiting instability, particularly in the Sahel. His visit to Kenya likely aimed to reinforce U.S. alliances in East Africa as a counterweight to these powers, especially given Kenya's strategic role in the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Regional tensions. The visit exacerbates tensions with African nations pursuing non-aligned or anti-Western policies. For example, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger's alliance of Sahel states explicitly rejects Western military presence, and Kenya's alignment with the U.S. is seen as undermining this regional push for sovereignty. Economic and security trade-offs. For Kenya, hosting Langley strengthens security cooperation but risks alienating African peers and domestic critics. Kenya's deepening ties with China, as seen in President Ruto's April 2025 meeting with Xi Jinping, suggest a delicate balancing act between Western and Eastern partnerships. Critical perspective. Langley's visit symbolizes a broader U.S. struggle to maintain relevance in Africa as anti-Western sentiment grows. The focus on independent operations may be less about empowering African nations and more about reducing U.S. costs while maintaining strategic footholds. Critics argue this approach still prioritizes U.S. interests, such as access to resources and countering China, over genuine African development. 3. Is this the beginning of the end for U.S. influence in Africa? Current state of U.S. influence. Declining footprint. The U.S. is scaling back its military presence, as evidenced by Langley's comments on burden sharing and the African Lion 2025 exercises focus on partner self-reliance. This follows a broader trend of reduced U.S. aid, with cuts to programs like PEPFAR impacting HIV/AIDS initiatives in South Africa and beyond. Competing powers. China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's support for the Alliance of Sahel states are filling gaps left by U.S. retrenchment. For instance, China's investments in Kenyan infrastructure, like the standard gauge railway, contrast with U.S. tariffs and aid cuts, making China a more attractive partner for some African nations. Policy shifts under Trump. The Trump administration's policies, including tariffs on African exports, e.g., 50% on Lesotho, 30% on South Africa, and the effective end of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, have strained U.S.-Africa relations. These moves, coupled with controversial narratives like the white genocide claim in South Africa, alienate African governments and publics. Arguments for declining U.S. influence, backlash against neocolonialism. The rejection of Langley in Kenya and criticism from groups like South Africa's EFF reflect growing African resistance to perceived U.S. interference. The EFF's defense of Burkina Faso's Traoré against U.S. allegations underscores this trend. Rise of alternatives. The BRICS alliance, including South Africa, and the Alliance of Sahel states offer African nations alternatives to Western partnerships. Russia's advisory role in the Sahel and China's infrastructure investments challenge U.S. dominance. Public sentiment. Posts on X, such as those from @African_stream, highlight a narrative of U.S. military presence as antithetical to African sovereignty, resonating with younger, digitally active Africans. Arguments against the end of U.S. influence, strategic strongholds. The U.S. retains significant leverage through bases like Manda Bay in Kenya and partnerships with countries like Morocco, as seen in African Lion 2025. These footholds ensure continued influence in key regions. Soft power. Despite aid cuts, U.S. cultural and economic influence persists through private sector engagement and historical ties. Kenya's government, for instance, values U.S. counterterrorism support, suggesting pragmatic alignment over ideological rejection. Global context. The U.S. remains a global superpower, and its ability to project power, even if reduced, is unlikely to vanish entirely. Africa's strategic importance ensures the U.S. will adapt rather than withdraw completely. Assessment. While U.S. influence is waning in parts of Africa due to competition and policy missteps, it's premature to call it the beginning of the end. The U.S. is recalibrating its approach, and countries like Kenya still see value in partnership. However, continued misalignments, like tariffs and inflammatory rhetoric, could accelerate a decline if not addressed. 4. Why are Kenyans calling him a sellout? Context of the sellout label. The term sellout in this context refers to General Langley, a U.S. Marine Corps general and AFRICOM commander, being perceived as prioritizing U.S. interests over African ones. This sentiment, evident in X posts, ties to his African-American heritage, which some critics expected would align him more closely with African interests. Reasons for the label: heritage versus role. As an African-American, Langley might be expected by some to empathize with African struggles against historical Western dominance. Instead, his leadership of AFRICOM, seen as a tool of U.S. imperialism, leads to accusations of betraying African ideals. A post by @MosCampton frames him as glorifying our own suppressors, reflecting this sentiment. Controversial statements. Langley's alleged remarks about Burkina Faso's Traoré as a threat fuel perceptions that he's advancing a U.S. agenda to destabilize African leaders who challenge Western control. This aligns with criticisms from South Africa's EFF, which sees U.S. allegations against Traoré as part of a pattern of meddling. Kenya's role. Kenya's hosting of Langley is seen by critics as enabling U.S. military dominance, and Langley, as AFRICOM's face, becomes a symbol of this alignment. The sellout label extends to Kenya's leadership, with figures like President Ruto criticized for deepening ties with the U.S. while other African nations reject Western presence, Pan-African narrative. The term reflects a broader Pan-African critique of African or diaspora figures who align with Western powers. Langley's role in promoting U.S. interests, like countering Chinese and Russian influence, clashes with the vision of African self-reliance championed by leaders like Traoré. Nuance. The sellout label is emotionally charged and may not reflect Langley's personal motivations. As a military officer, his role is to execute U.S. policy, not to represent African interests. The criticism may also stem from frustration with Kenya's foreign policy rather than Langley himself. 5. Is this the beginning of a stronger African alliance against Western dominance? Emerging African alliances. Alliance of Sahel states. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have formed a mutual defense pact to counter terrorism and foreign intervention, explicitly rejecting French and U.S. military presence. This alliance, supported by Russia, represents a bold step toward regional sovereignty, BRICS, and non-alignment. South Africa's role in BRICS, alongside its historical ties to Russia, positions it as a counterweight to Western influence. Other African nations, like Zimbabwe, are navigating relations with both the U.S. and non-Western powers, suggesting a multipolar approach to Pan-African sentiment. The backlash against Langley's visit, as seen in X posts, reflects growing Pan-African unity against perceived neo-colonialism. The EFF support for Burkina Faso and criticism of U.S. interference indicate a broader ideological push for African solidarity. Signs of a stronger alliance, rejection of Western narratives, the dismissal of U.S. claims about Burkina Faso's gold revenues and Traoré's leadership by South Africa's EFF and others signals a unified front against external interference. Alternative partnerships. China's infrastructure investments and Russia's military support provide African nations with options beyond Western aid, emboldening them to challenge U.S. dominance. Kenya's upgraded ties with China, for instance, show a willingness to diversify partnerships. Regional cooperation. The Alliance of Sahel States demonstrates that African nations are willing to collaborate on security and economic goals without Western oversight, a model that could inspire other regions. Challenges to a stronger alliance. Internal divisions. Not all African nations share the same vision. Kenya's alignment with the U.S. contrasts with the Sahel's rejection of Western presence, creating friction. South Africa's trade-focused approach to the U.S. also differs from Burkina Faso's defiance. Economic dependence. Many African economies, including Kenya's, rely on Western trade and aid. U.S. tariffs and the end of AGOA could push countries toward China, but this shift risks new forms of dependency rather than true independence. Capacity constraints. The Alliance of Sahel States and similar initiatives face challenges in funding and coordinating effective governance and security without external support, limiting their ability to fully replace Western partnerships. Assessment. The rejection of Langley's visit and support for leaders like Traoré suggest a growing African resolve to challenge Western dominance. However, a cohesive, continent-wide alliance is not yet realized due to differing national priorities and economic realities. This could be a starting point, but its success depends on overcoming internal divisions and building sustainable alternatives to Western partnerships.